And just this weekend, I was here on telling people last night in the Saturday service that previous night, so Friday night, Saturday morning, I was actually here until 2 in the morning, praying and just processing what it is God wants us to do with this merger and processing that whole thing and making sure that we're aligned with what God wants to do, not what we want to do or our agendas or anything like that. And then just praying through this teaching and through this series, because we're really excited about this series. And so we are in the second week of a series called Hope in Exile. And the whole idea of the series is, how do we find hope in God, in Jesus, in the midst of pain, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of despair, in the midst of confusion or questions or challenges? How do we find hope in exile? And the word exile is a word that we've been using and processing, and I think the word means a variety of different things in a variety of different contexts. And so in terms of what we're looking at, I would say that exile is sometimes it's something that just happens to us. Sometimes we can't control it, like a diagnosis that just happens. We can't control that, and then we're kind of immediately thrust into exile. And then sometimes our own decisions, our own actions or behaviors kind of can put us into exile, but nonetheless we're still in this period of exile. And exile, I think, is kind of a nebulous kind of definition, kind of what we're getting at. But I think really it's this idea that it's being thrust out of what was normal and into a spot that is uncomfortable. And so exile is a variety of different things. Exile could be a diagnosis, it could be a job loss, it could be relational struggles, those kinds of things. But exile means a ton of different things. And so that's kind of what we're wrestling through as we look through this Hope in Exile series. And so I want to go through this. Brian talked last week about Jeremiah 29 verses 1 through 10, the first 10 verses of that chapter. And then I'm covering, it's kind of like a part 2 to his teaching. I'm covering Jeremiah 29, 10 through 14. And so we're going to cover the same passage, verse 10, this week that we did last week, because it's really important for context. And here's the other thing for context that we need to know. What's happening at this point in Jeremiah 29 is that the Israelites are in exile. Now, they are in a locational exile. So in 586 BC, this is an actual historical event, 586 BC, the Israelites are basically under the Assyrian Empire, and the Babylonians from Babylon, they come in, they lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, they destroy Jerusalem, the wall surrounding the city, everything, and then they basically deport in 4 major deportations the Israelites out of Israel, and they move them about 800 miles east to Babylon, where they're from, right? Or there's a city called Ur. This is actually modern-day Baghdad, Iraq, is where they're exiled to. So they're in exile, a locational exile for them. They're removed from this land that God has given them, that they're promised, this land flowing with milk and honey, where they have this hope that God is with them. So they're gone. Like, they're not in that land anymore, and they are in Babylon under exile. And Jeremiah is one of the prophets who's in exile at the time that this is actually occurring. And there were a bunch of other prophets, and some of them were actually prophets of God. You have Ezekiel, Daniel are both prophets that were in this time of exile. But then you have these other people who are basically false prophets, who are speaking, but they're not speaking on behalf of God, and they've got their own agenda. And one of the things that was happening in this time, in Jeremiah 29, 8 through 9, like the verses right before this, that are preceding this, is that the false prophets are saying something that God is saying is not true. What they're saying is, hey, you're in exile, we're in exile here, but the exile is going to end soon. In one case, one of the prophets says, one of the false prophets says 2 years. It's going to be 2 years. And you're going to get out of this. It's going to be great. We're going to be fine. We're just going to go through this little period, and it's going to be okay. And so verse 10, where we're picking up, is the passage where God is saying something to the false prophets that are there and kind of attacking the notion that, hey, this is not true. And so verse 10, it starts by saying this. It says, this is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, 70 years, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. And so what God is saying is, listen, you've been hearing that there are these false prophets who are saying 2 years or a shorter time than you might expect, but the reality is it's not 2 years. It's not even a short period of time. It's 70 years. Some people would suggest that like 597 BC is when these deportations actually started happening. And so in 522, 523 BC is when the exile actually ends and the Israelites return back. And so this is a period of 70 years. I mean, this actually happened. It's true. This whole thing, 70 years, actually exists. Or actually happened and actually existed. And so 70 years is this time. I mean, this is a massive amount of time that the Israelites are in exile. So now the next verse, so that was Jeremiah 29:10. Jeremiah 29:11 is the very next verse. And the reason why I stopped there is because Jeremiah 29:11 is one of the most well-known quoted verses in Scripture. And for those of you who have been connected in church for a period of time, you probably heard this. Maybe not, but you probably have. And I would even argue that some of you this is your very first time in church, you may have seen this verse somewhere, because Jeremiah 29:11 is the thing that Facebook inspirational posts are made of. You want to see like an internet meme? Jeremiah 29:11 is in it with like a lighthouse and a sunset or something that makes us happy, okay? So this is the verse, Jeremiah 29:11, that you may be familiar with. This is what it says. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. I mean, this is this great inspirational passage that people use all the time, right? Plans to give you a hope and a future. And then it goes on in verse 12. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. And so you have this verse 10, which is like 70 years. And then the very next verse, 11, is, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. And I think one of the reasons why this verse, Jeremiah 29:11, is so quoted, or so well used, basically, is that I think in this regard, in this chapter, it's the first promise in Jeremiah 29, where Jeremiah 29 is just filled with this doomsday message, complete hopelessness. And so Jeremiah 29:11 hits, and the Israelites are like, yes! Like, we've got hope! This is great! I mean, this is good news! For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. This is great for the Israelites. But here's what I think happens for us today, is that when we read Jeremiah 29:11, I think we have a tendency to use Jeremiah 29:11 as a sort of security blanket. And by that I mean to say that we begin to think, okay, God has a plan for me that's good. So clearly this pain and this suffering and the despair and all of this stuff that I'm going through is going to end really soon, and then I'll begin to prosper. Like, I think we have this tendency to think, okay, it's just going to be done really, really quick, and obviously we want to get out of suffering as soon as possible because we're human beings and nobody likes to suffer. I mean, suffering is painful. Exile is brutal. It's difficult to go through, and so why would we want to stay in that, right? So we got this promise from God. Let's just get out of exile as soon as possible. But here's the problem when we use Jeremiah 29:11 as a safety blanket. It's that Jeremiah 29:11 comes right after Jeremiah 29:10, where God says that the exile is not going to end anytime soon. It's going to be 70 years. It's not like we're just going to get out of this conflict that we're in. This is going to be a while. And I wonder if Jeremiah 29, or this whole narrative, this whole flow, is God trying to tell the Israelites, this is how you trust me in the midst of exile that's not going to end soon. Or maybe this is how you trust me when you don't know how it's going to end. So Jeremiah 29:11 is hopeful. I mean, we got this promise, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. But in some ways, it's also this reminder to say, well, he's saying that because there's 70 years that the Israelites have to wait. And so I wonder if the point is that God is trying to say it's not about necessarily getting out of exile immediately, but it's about trying to find hope and trust in me while you're going through that pain and suffering and despair. The other thing about this passage that's interesting is that God's words in Jeremiah 29:11 say, For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. And I think what we have a tendency to do when we see that passage is we're like, okay, well, there's plans, so here's what I'm going to do. Here are my plans. Here are the things, the steps that I need to take in order to get out of exile. And we start making the plans about us. And instead, the actual passage is saying, no, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. They're God's plans, not our plans. And isn't it true that we tend to want to control things that happen in life? We tend to come to God with agendas. And we say, okay, God, this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen. And we forget that God is actually the one with the plan. It's his plans. And so when we go to God with agendas and we say, these are the different things that I'm going to do to get out of exile, what ends up happening is oftentimes we forget that God is the one saying, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. And so I think we have this tendency to put our own agenda in and mix it in with God's actual plans. These are God's plans, not ours. God restores. But God restores, and it's his timing, and it's his way. So God is a restoring God, but it happens through his timing and his way, not often through our own agenda or our own plan. And so the other thing that's interesting is that we've done a lot of research, Brian and I, especially on like story and narrative and story arc, and even how do you put together sermons that people want to listen to for a long time, and what does sermons look like, and story in general. And there's this book that I read. I'm a voracious reader. I love to read, and I would say that I don't know that there's a book on the planet that I have read over the last 10 years that has shaped me the way this book has. It's a book called 1,000,000 Miles in 1,000 Years by a guy named Donald Miller. And the book is all about what it means to live a great story. And the definition of story that he uses is he says that a story is a character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it. This is regularly quoted in our house. A story is a character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it. And what he argues in the book is that the best stories that you know are the ones that are filled with conflict. They're the ones that are filled with conflict, and they're the ones where the protagonist, the main character in the story, goes through something unbelievably difficult. They overcome it, and they get what they want in the end. You don't walk away from a movie without conflict and be like, man, that was awesome. You don't. Like, those are the worst movies, aren't they? And you might not know, you might not realize, oh, that's why that movie wasn't good, that's why it didn't resonate with me. But the reason why, he would argue, is that because there was no conflict. The best movies, the ones that we walk out of and we resonate the most, the ones where we say, wow, there was substance to that, are the ones that have conflict that people overcome because we can find ourselves in those. Here's the problem, though, is that we don't like conflict in real life. And so we tend to avoid conflict. We tend to try to get out of it immediately. And this is what the false prophets are doing. The false prophets are trying to say, hey, listen, 2 years, we're done. And God is like, no. 70 years. 70 years. And so there's this quote in this book, A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, that says, he says, great stories are told in conflict, but we are unwilling to embrace the potential greatness of the story we are actually in because we want to avoid conflict. And then this slide, it says, we think God is unjust rather than a master storyteller. Isn't it true that when we go through pain and we go through suffering, we go through despair, we go through questions and confusion and doubt, and all of this stuff, that we tend to think, for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus, man, why isn't God on my side? Come on, I've done everything I can to follow you, and then you just bail on me here? I'm going through this exile? And so we tend to think that God is unjust, and we forget that God is actually this brilliant, masterful storyteller. That he knows the end of the story. That he knows this. Like, this is what this promise is all about, is he's trying to say, hey, listen, for I know the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. You're in exile for 70 years, but that's a temporal issue. The eternal hope that I have is different because I know the end of the story. God is a brilliant, masterful storyteller, and he's asking the Israelites, while you're in this conflict, while you're in exile, can you see me here? That's what these promises are for. And what I would say is that, if you want to go to the next slide, is that God's promises serve as a reminder that even though we're in exile, nothing is as powerful as God. Because what's actually happening here, the brilliance of this whole thing, and God saying 70 years, and then the very next verse giving this promise, is that God is setting something up for the Israelites. Before he says this, the power that Babylon has over the Israelites is massive. It's enormous. They have so much power over the Israelites. And then God offers this promise, and when he gives them the promise, you realize what happens when God has this promise. When he says, I know the end of the story, is that the power that the Babylonians had over the Israelites tends to shrink. That power tends to decrease, and God's power tends to increase. The recognition that God actually knows the end of the story, that causes God's power to actually rise and the Babylonian power to actually begin to shrink. Because what the Israelites realize in this moment is, man, this exile that we're in, the Babylonians, it feels really powerful. And this is what exile feels for a lot of us, is it feels so fiercely strong. But man, they're not going to win in the end. Like they don't win at the end of the day. God is the one who knows the end of the story. And the end of the story is we're back in Israel. And so in the midst of this, it's really a tension game of who has the most power? Who has the most power, the Babylonians or God? And so I would say it this way too, that we lose hope when we let other voices become louder in our head than God. This is when we start losing hope, is when that Babylonian power becomes more powerful and we say, we're never ever going to get out of this. And so God's power tends to decrease. And God is saying, no, I know the plans I have for you. I know them. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you a great hope in the future. Like I know this story. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, hey, is the loudest voice in your head during this 70-year period going to be the Babylonians? Is that going to be the loudest voice? Or is it going to be me? What will be the loudest voice for the Israelites? And so I would say for us going through exile, for us going through times of pain and suffering and despair and grief, longing, questions, all of that, what are you going to allow to have the loudest voice in your exile? What will be the loudest voice for you. For those of you who came in and your marriage is in disarray, for those of you who came in and the brokenness of your marriage feels so strong, will you let the feeling that you cannot overcome this and your marriage is going to fall apart, will you let that be the loudest voice? Or will you say, no, God has a different plan for me. And we let God's plan, this whole I have a plan for I know the plans I have for you, will that be the loudest voice for you? Which will be the loudest voice? That you can't overcome a broken marriage, or that God's power will redeem you, set you free, restore what's broken? For those of you who are struggling through addiction, the thing that's so difficult about an addiction is that addictions become the loudest voice in our head. So for those of us struggling with an addiction, for those people who have struggled with an addiction, the issue is that you will do anything you can to get that next fix. So if I could just get the next fix, that'd be great. And what ends up happening is that addiction becomes louder in your head than the power of God and the promise of God that He wants to give you. If you're struggling with an addiction, what is more powerful, the addiction or that God can free you from that addiction? Maybe it's failure. Maybe you failed. And so in your past, you've just struggled through failure. Maybe it's a sin issue. Maybe you struggled in your job and you failed in your job. And so what ends up happening is you sit there and stew in the failure. And the failure becomes the loudest voice. Maybe you were fired. And you getting fired becomes the loudest voice in your head. And you feel like you can't overcome that. And so you just sit. And all that happens in that moment is we wallow in our self-pity. And we can't get over it, and what God wants to do is say, no, I know the plans I have for you. And you might be in exile, and it might last a while, but I have something greater. What is going to be the loudest voice for you? Maybe it's broken relationships, and you think that relationship will never be what it once was, and so the feeling that it will never be there again is the loudest voice in your head. And God is trying to say, no, but I know the plans I have for you. He's trying to become the loudest voice in our head. What are you going to allow to have the loudest voice in your exile? Maybe it's finances. Maybe some of you are like up to your eyeballs in debt. And you just can't see a way out because you're struggling through debt right now. And so you just feel like, I don't know what I'm going to do to get out of debt. And maybe God is trying to say, hey, listen, it might take a while. It might require some work. But I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Maybe it's that you need to make God the loudest voice in your exile and not the despair or the grief or the pain or the sorrow or the questions that you're going through. What is the loudest voice for you in your time of exile? I've shared stories about my dad before, and my dad is, I have great parents. And I don't say that enough. I put my parents in exile a lot when I was younger. Made their job very, very difficult. And in the midst of it, they loved me through it, and they're so supportive today. And I have incredible parents. And so I've shared before that my dad is like a hero to me. And we are a very close relationship. And my dad is one of those people in life who they're just good at everything. Do you know those kinds of people? They just infuriate you because they're just good at everything. They can just start something and they're really good at it. And you're like, why can't I even be good at one thing, right? Nobody else like this here? Am I the only one who's struggling through this jealousy and I need counseling? You guys want to join me for group therapy here with this? Like, these people are just good at everything. My dad is one of those guys. He's like valedictorian class. Brilliant. My dad spent 21 years in the Air Force. He retired from the military. He did like briefings at the Pentagon and all this stuff. I was downstairs one time when I was a little kid and I found all of these boxes and boxes of these awards that he'd been given and all this stuff. And like I grew up, my dad's like this hero kind of guy. Like, and not just me, but like other people have perceived him to be this. He's just good at what he did in the military. And so my dad, he never failed at anything. He just always succeeded. And so he retires from the military, and we moved to this small little town in northern Maine where my mom is from. And And so we moved there, and we settled in, and this new company opened up in northern Maine, and the company's called Deprez. And it's a very long story to explain what they do, so I'm not going to do that. But what they did was they hired at this particular branch of Deprez like 600 to 800 people all at once, like in one fell swoop. And so my dad was one of the 600, 800 people in this tiny little town that this company hired. And so my dad went in as like an entry-level job after he retired, and like one of the little minion workers kind of thing. And then in my dad's overachieving, annoying brilliance, he just works his way up and up and up and up through the company until my dad at this branch was like third in charge of this area. He was overseeing this massive group of people and just crushing his job, just killing it. And there were a couple people over him, and this one particular woman named Jody was one of his bosses. And so one day, in the midst of this, my dad gets called into Jody's office. And Jody proceeds to tell my dad, she said, Dan, we're actually going to demote you. And we actually you're not going to be in this division of the company anymore, but we're going to move you to a different division of the company. And my dad is sitting there like stunned. My dad doesn't understand. So my dad's shocked about this, and she's really vague. It was just a brutal experience for my dad. So I remember my dad calling me that night, and my dad saying, I don't know what happened, but like I lost my job, and I got demoted. They moved me to this different department, and I don't know what happened. And so I was like, I felt terrible for my dad. I was like, oh my goodness, that's awful. I'm so sorry. And so we started talking about it a little more, and he was explaining, he's like, I don't know what Jody's thinking. And so he starts getting really frustrated with Jody. Like, I don't know what she's thinking. I'm one of the best workers there. I've done so well. I've given my heart to this company for the last little while. Like, what in the world? And so my dad starts getting more and more angry about Jody. And so we hang up the phone, and we talked a few times over the course of the next few weeks. And this went on for months. It's about 4 months of this, where every time I would talk to my dad was just more confused. He was in this time of exile, and he was getting more and more and more angry at Jody. And then one day, my dad walks into Deprez, about 4 months later, walks into the company, and he goes into the area that my dad used to oversee, like the big department, or this big division of the company, and the entire room was vacant. It was just empty. Like everything had been taken out. Chairs had been taken out, desks had been taken out, cubicles had been taken out. It was just like a ghost town. It was gone. So my dad walks into the new division that he'd been working for the last few months, and he was like, what is going on out there? And one of the employees said, oh, you haven't heard. Deprez shut down that division of the company. It's like, what? That division of the company doesn't exist anymore. And so my dad went into Jody's office to go see her. And what my dad, over the course of the conversation with Jody, began to realize is that Jody moved him out of that division to another division because she knew all along that department was going to close. She knew all along that all of those people were going to lose their job. And what Jody was doing in that moment was Jody was actually saving my dad's job, and he didn't even see it coming. So what happens is over the course of these 4 months, my dad gets more angry and more frustrated and bitter towards Jody because he doesn't know the end of the story. And isn't it true that when we come up against conflict or tension or despair or difficulty or suffering or grief or pain, that we can easily become angry at God because we just don't know the end of the story. And we become angry with God because we forget that God is actually the master storyteller. That God is the one who says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future. I think what tends to happen in life is we tend to become angry at our circumstances And we end up taking it out on God, or we end up taking it out on other people because we just simply don't know how it's going to resolve. And the Israelites, in this moment, are being asked by God, will you put your trust and your faith and your hope in me in the midst of this 70 years of exile, even though you're still in it? One of the things that I love about this passage is that the passage serves as a reminder of something. That even though the Israelites are in exile, even though they're locationally moved, they're in exile, God is still dialoguing with them. God is still saying things like, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. God is still in discussion with them. And I would say this, that God never exiles himself from us. We tend to exile ourselves from God. God is not in the abandonment business. But what happens is that when we go through pain and grief and suffering, we tend to push away God. And we're the ones who exile ourselves from him, as opposed to God exiling himself from us. God doesn't exile ourselves or himself from us. We just are the ones who tend to do that to God. I was talking to, there's this passage in verse 14, and I was talking to a friend about this, and I was saying, it's really fascinating. There's this language that's used, because I don't know what it means about God. And at the end it says, I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. That's the language. I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. And I was saying to the friend, like, what does that mean? Does that mean that, like, God himself is the one who picks us up and brings us into exile and just plops us down? Is that what that means? And so he was saying, well, I wonder if there's another way to read that. And the more he started processing, I realized there are two ways to read it. One is that God himself is the one who does that. But then he says, I wonder if the language from which I carried you into exile is used because God knows that while we're in exile, we are not able to make it on our own. And so what God does is he literally carries us through this exile. He says, I know that you can't stand up on your own, so I'll just carry you through this. God does not exile himself from us. We tend to do that to God. God is still present even in the midst of the pain and the suffering and the grief. God is still there. And so, in the midst of this conversation with this friend, we were talking, he was like, well, what does this mean? How do you even trust God when you're in these circumstances? He brought up this passage from Romans. He said, and it was so good, but this passage says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. I love the language there because God is giving us one role in this moment. And the one role is, will you trust in God in the midst of your exile? Because God is a God of hope. And so when you put your trust in him, as you put your trust in him, what ends up happening is that we overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. So putting our hope in God gives us hope in exile. Putting our trust in God gives us hope in the midst of all the pain and the grief and the suffering and the questions and the confusion that we're going through. And so I would ask the question, are you trusting God that in the midst of the 70 years, right in the thick of it, do you trust God that he is bigger, that he is louder, way more powerful than the circumstances of the exile you are in? And so here's the way I'd love to close this. I'm not naive. We're busy people, right? And so what we've realized sometimes is that if we don't take a moment to just pause and be quiet and reflect, then oftentimes we just get really, really busy and we'll go back to the normalcy of our life. And so what I want us to do is for all of us, just for a brief moment, and then I'm going to end with the benediction. We'll stand in a second. I'll end with the benediction. But for a brief moment, let's just shut our eyes, let's bow our heads, and just process what some of this stuff means. So I'm going to lead us through some of this stuff, and then there's going to be some silence too. For some of us in here, the thing we need to own to God right now in our time of reflection is that we have come to God with our own plans and agendas. And so maybe for some of you, during this time of silence that's going to come up, it's just owning the fact that you need to set aside your plans and trust that God, He has plans for you. Maybe that's you in this moment of silence. For some of you, maybe the thing that you're wrestling through is that you have made the circumstances of your exile, maybe the exile itself, you have made that the loudest voice in your head, and you need to be reminded of the fact that God's voice should be the loudest voice. And so if that's you, maybe it's coming clean to say, that will no longer be the loudest voice for me. God, you need to be the loudest voice for me. So process that in this moment of silence.